In the heart of the 14th century, a cataclysm unparalleled in human history began to stir, an event that would forever alter the course of Western civilization. This was the onset of the Black Death, a pandemic that would reshape the very fabric of medieval Europe. The plague's journey began far from the shores of Europe, originating in the arid plains of Central Asia. It was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, a virulent pathogen living in fleas. These fleas, in turn, infested the black rats that were ubiquitous on merchant caravans and ships. For years, the pestilence moved silently along the intricate network of trade routes known as the Silk Road. In 1347, the plague made its dramatic and fatal arrival in Europe at the Sicilian port of Messina. 12 Genoese trading ships, returning from the Black Sea, docked with a horrifying cargo. Most of the sailors aboard were either dead or gravely ill, their bodies covered in black boils. These boils, which gave the disease its name, were a terrifying hallmark of the bubonic plague. Sicilian authorities, in a panic, ordered the fleet of death ships out of the harbor. But it was too late. The plague had already disembarked. Messina, the disease spread with terrifying speed throughout Sicily. By January 1348, the plague had reached Marseille, France and Tunis in North Africa. The disease was mercilessly efficient, traveling via both maritime and land-based trade routes. It soon infiltrated Italy, Spain, and France, leaving a trail of death in its wake. Paris, one of the largest cities in Europe, was struck with devastating force. The plague reached England in the summer of 1348, arriving in Dorset. By November, it had made its way to the crowded, unsanitary streets of London. The symptoms were horrific, and the onset was swift. Victims suffered from fever, chills, vomiting, and the agonizing appearance of buboes. Death often occurred within 2 to 7 days of the first symptoms. The sheer number of deaths was overwhelming for the living. Mass graves were dug to accommodate the endless stream of bodies. Entire villages were wiped out, leaving behind only silent, empty houses. The social order began to collapse under the strain. Parents abandoned their sick children, and spouses left each other to die. Fear and suspicion became the new currency of human interaction. Physicians had no answer for the disease, relying on ineffective treatments. Bloodletting and superstitious remedies were commonplace, but useless. The church, a cornerstone of medieval life, was powerless. Priests and bishops died at the same rate as the common folk. This eroded the faith of many, who felt abandoned by God. Some turned to religious extremism, seeking divine intervention. The flagellant movement saw groups of penitents traveling from town to town, whipping themselves to atone for the world's sins. Others sought scapegoats to blame for the catastrophe. Jewish communities were frequently and unjustly targeted, accused of poisoning wells. Horrific pogroms erupted across Europe, leading to the massacre of thousands of innocent people. The economic consequences of the plague were profound and immediate. With up to half of the population gone, the labor force was decimated. This created a severe labor shortage across the continent. For the first time, peasants and laborers found themselves in a position of power. They could demand higher wages and better working conditions. The rigid structure of feudalism, which had defined medieval society, began to crumble. Serfs, once tied to the land, found new mobility and opportunities. Landowners were forced to innovate, switching to less labor-intensive forms of agriculture like sheep farming. The price of grain plummeted due to the decreased demand from a smaller population. However, the price of manufactured goods and labor skyrocketed. This shift in wealth led to the rise of a new middle class. Governments tried to fight these economic changes with legislation. England's Statute of Labourers in 1351 attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. Such measures were largely unenforceable and bred widespread resentment. This tension eventually boiled over into popular uprisings. The Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381 was a direct consequence of the post-plague social and economic climate. By 1351, the first and most devastating wave of the plague began to subside. It left behind a continent in mourning and profound transformation. Europe's population had been reduced by an estimated 30 to 50%. The psychological impact on the survivors was immense. Art and literature became obsessed with themes of death and mortality. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a common artistic motif. It depicted death as a great equalizer, taking the rich and poor alike. The plague did not disappear entirely after 1351. It returned in subsequent waves for centuries, though none as deadly as the first. These recurrences kept the population low for more than a century. The experience led to the first organized public health responses. The concept of quarantine, isolating ships and people for 40 days, was born in the port city of Ragusa. Medicine, having been proven so ineffective, began a slow process of change. There was a move away from blind reliance on ancient texts toward more empirical observation. The Black Death accelerated the end of the Middle Ages. It weakened the two central pillars of the medieval world, the church and the feudal nobility. The power of kings and centralized states grew as the local lords' power waned. The widespread social and economic upheaval paved the way for the Renaissance. With old structures broken, new ideas in art, science, and philosophy could take root. The shared trauma created a more uniform European culture. The decline of Latin and the rise of vernacular languages were hastened. The Black Death was a horrifying tragedy of unimaginable scale. It killed millions and caused immense suffering and chaos. Yet it also acted as a powerful, if brutal, agent of change. It cleared away the rigid hierarchies of the medieval period. It inadvertently empowered the common person and reshaped the economy. The world that emerged from the shadow of the plague was a world on the cusp of modernity. The Black Death remains a stark reminder of the fragility of human civilization. It demonstrates how a microscopic organism can bring a continent to its knees. The legacy of the plague is woven into the economic, political, and social DNA of modern Europe. The pandemic began its retreat, leaving survivors to rebuild a shattered world. Inheritance laws were profoundly affected as entire families were erased. Vast fortunes were consolidated by distant relatives or even the church. The sudden wealth for some survivors fueled new patterns of consumption and investment. Universities and schools suffered as well, losing masters and students. However, the need for educated administrators led to the founding of new colleges. The psychological trauma manifested as a live-for-the-moment attitude in some. For others, it induced a deep and pervasive piety and fear of God's wrath. The plague's spread was aided by the general lack of sanitation in medieval cities. Crowded living conditions allowed the disease to pass easily from person to person. The pneumonic form of the plague was even more terrifying, spreading directly through the air. This form had a near 100% mortality rate. The crisis spurred a demand for vernacular medical texts that lay people could read. It marked the beginning of the end for the absolute authority of Galenic medicine. The demographic collapse meant that land was plentiful and cheap. This allowed some peasants to become landowners for the first time in their family's history. The nobility's attempts to reassert control often led to violent clashes. The Jacquerie in France in 1358 was another such peasant uprising. The plague reshaped the physical landscape of Europe. Reforestation occurred on a massive scale as agricultural land was abandoned. This environmental change had long-term effects on flora and fauna. The end of the plague era was not a single event, but a slow, painful recovery. Generations were born into a world where the plague was a recent, living memory. This collective trauma shaped their worldview, making them both resilient and wary. The Black Death was a crucible that burned away the old world. From its ashes, a new Europe, on the path to the Renaissance and the modern age, would eventually rise. The plague's impact on art was not limited to death motifs. Some patrons commissioned works as a form of thanksgiving for their survival. This led to a surge in artistic patronage from the newly wealthy classes. The focus on individual experience and emotion in art grew stronger. The plague also changed funeral and burial customs. Desire for individual remembrance grew, leading to more elaborate tombs for those who could afford them. The fear of sudden, unconfessed death heightened the importance of a good death. This was reflected in the popularity of ars moriendi, or the art of dying texts. These guidebooks instructed people on how to die well, according to Christian ideals. The plague's recurring nature created a permanent sense of uncertainty. Municipal governments became more organized, creating health boards and sanitation rules. This was the beginning of modern urban public administration. The loss of skilled artisans in some fields was so severe, it took generations to recover. In other areas, the labor shortage spurred technological innovation. The Black Death challenged people's understanding of the world and their place in it. It forced a confrontation with mortality that was both terrifying and transformative. The echoes of this 14th century catastrophe can still be found in our culture. Nursery rhymes like "Ring Around the Rosie" are often thought to originate from plague symptoms. The phrase "a pocket full of posies" may refer to the herbs carried to ward off the smell of death. Ashes could symbolize the cremation of bodies. "We all fall down" chillingly represents the finality of death from the plague. The plague's influence extended to the very language people spoke. Words like quarantine entered the vocabulary directly because of the pandemic. The Black Death was not just a medical event, it was a historical turning point. It demonstrated the interconnectedness of the known world, even in the 14th century. A disease in Asia could, and did, bring Europe to the brink of collapse. The recovery was long, and the world that emerged was irrevocably changed. It reshaped demographics, economics, religion, and culture on a fundamental level. The Black Death stands as a testament to human resilience in the face of overwhelming disaster. Ultimately, the survivors and their descendants built the foundations of the modern world.